all the regions that we learned on the human brain. So we're going to identify these same features on the sheep brain. Okay? So, no. Okay. I was just checking to see if I had a laser pointer on that thing. I hit the wrong button. All right. So, our sheep brain is obviously going to be smaller than the human brain that we looked at the picture of and we looked at the model of. But the major differences between these two are the size of the cerebrum. The size of the cerebrum is different. Our cerebrum is much, much larger than the cerebrum of a sheep brain, and that's because we have a much more developed cerebrum. Another difference is the orientation of brain stem. We stand upright, so our brain stem is basically going up and down, isn't it? Yeah. That sheep brain stem is going to be going kind of horizontal. So it's going to look different. So just make sure that you be able to find all these features that we saw in the human brain, but sometimes it looks a little bit different. So I want us to look at the bottom of the sheep brain first. This is kind of the same orientation that we looked at the cranial nerves. Remember, we can see the cranial nerves underneath. What we're going to see first of all is that this sheep brain is covered with dura mater. Y'all remember what dura mater is? It's one of the meninges. It's the outermost layer. And it looks pretty tough and durable. And it is. You're going to have to cut it off. Okay? It's all of this opaque white looking stuff. In some places it's thick enough that it's even hard to cut with a pair of scissors. But that's one of the first things you're going to do when you get your sheep brain is remove the dura mater. Okay? But you need to be careful because if you don't use care, you'll pull the pituitary off. Okay? So, by looking at the underneath, you should be able to see this first pair of cranial nerves right here. These are your olfactory bulbs, which are parts of the olfactory nerves. So I don't know if this is on your list, but it's probably a good thing for you to find. On some of our sheep brains, this is, in fact, got some bone on it. When they harvest the brain from the sheep, they just kind of chop off its nose.
The bulbs, olfactory bulbs.
Mm-hmm. So there's some bone quite often attached to those olfactory bulbs. Think about the fact that our olfactory bulbs are laying on top of the cribriform plate. So basically what they're doing is they often still have some of the bone on them. I didn't look at these real carefully, but I'm hoping they've got dura mater on. They were ordered for the biology class. Okay. Right underneath here, you have a Y-shaped structure. This is actually part of the optic chiasma. So this is where our two optic nerves cross. Right here.
That's your optic chiasma?
The optic chiasma is right here where they cross. So one of these is going to go over to one eyeball, and the other one goes over to this eyeball.
So
remember, where that crosses is called the optic chiasma. Okay, directly beneath this optic chiasma, do you see this brown structure? This is the pituitary gland. Proportionally, it's larger in the sheep brain than it is in the human brain. Okay? And then the rest of this is in fact the brain stem that's going horizontal from the cerebrum. Okay? So all of this region is the brain stem. All right. Now, this next picture is going to show what your brain the brain of the sheep should look like once you get it all cleaned up and you get the dura mater off of it. Now, everywhere that it's wrinkled is what part of the brain?
Cerebrum.
The cerebrum. So the cerebrum goes from here to right here. Our cerebrum is much larger than that, isn't it? But it is wrinkled. So what tissue you is directly beneath all those wrinkles.
Like that.
Gray matter.
I don't know.
It's gray matter, and what do we call it?
Cerebral cortex.
Cerebral cortex. So, one thing we will be doing before we get rid of the brain, you're going to cut one of these hemispheres in half, and you should be able to open it up and see all the gray matter around the surface and the white matter that's in underneath all those wrinkles. The wrinkles are made of the ridges and the grooves. What do we call those? It's gyri and sulci. The gyri are the ridges, the sulci are the grooves. Okay? All right, now, let's see. Here is the cerebrum. What is this area of white matter here
Is that your
called?
dying?
This is the corpus callosum. White matter. Corpus callosum. We're going to talk about that again in a minute. Now, let's look here underneath. I just told y'all what these three structures are when we were looking at the bottom of the brain. What do you think this is right here? It's the olfactory bulbs. They're laying right here underneath this frontal lobe. Okay? That's your olfactory bulbs. What is this right here? It's white matter. What is it? This is your optic chiasma. When you cut this in half, you end up cutting it right in the middle of that X. So remember, this is optic nerves, so it should look white, shouldn't it? Okay? And then right behind that, this is our pituitary.
Which one?
This brown thing right here is the pituitary. Okay? So you should be labeling the sheep brain the same way that you did the human brain. Okay, so I would say that this area right in here should be your diencephalon. So just kind of do a big oval here. All of this right here. Up above the pituitary and up above your optic chiasma. So all this central area. Okay. Now we're identifying two regions in the diencephalon, right? The thalamus, if you'll remember, it looks oval. Do you see the thalamus right here? Do you see this space around here? Okay, that defines the upper margins of it. I'm going to be talking about some of these spaces before we leave. The thalamus. This right here is the thalamus. Now between the thalamus and the pituitary, what do we have? The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, it's between the thalamus, which is right here, and the pituitary, which is right here. So right in here is your hypothalamus. Remember, the pituitary is attached to the hypothalamus. Okay, so what is this back here?
Cerebellum.
That's our cerebellum. It means little brain. This posterior region here is the cerebellum. For us, the cerebellum is lying underneath the cerebrum, isn't it? It's right up underneath here in the occipital region. Okay? So, if this is the cerebellum, we have some white matter in it too, don't we? What is that white matter called? Looks like a tree. Arbor vitae, and that means tree of life. Okay? So all this white matter is the arbor vitae. So do you see gray matter around it? Is the surface of the cerebellum wrinkledy? So, it has cortex as well. It's cerebellar cortex. Now this cerebellum has as many neurons as the cerebrum does, if not more. Okay? This is the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. Vitae means life. Okay? Arbor means tree. All right, so this region right here is the brain stem, and what it's doing is it's attaching the brain to the spinal cord, isn't it? Okay? And all of the incoming and outgoing information has to pass by way of some part of the brain stem. So what is this uppermost portion right in here called? Midbrain. And we're gonna say from about here to here is the pons. The pons is anterior or in front of the cerebellum. I would say it's between here. I always say I know it's in front of this notch. And then below that would be the medulla oblongata. And then what does that attach to? The spinal cord. Where does the spinal cord begin? The foramen magnum. So the foramen magnum is that dividing line between the brain stem and the spinal cord, but they're continuous, aren't they? They're basically continuous. They are the same axons. It's the same nervous tissue. Okay. Now, before we go any further, I need to talk about the ventricular system in the brain. The ventricular system consists of 4 spaces within the brain. That filter the blood supply and produce cerebral spinal fluid. You should recognize that as representing cerebrospinal fluid. This is the only marker I have found up here. Can you see the orange okay? Kind of? Okay. So we have 4 ventricles, and we do have models of the ventricles. There's one right here. So I want you to make sure that you look at this model. This represents 4 spaces that are within the brain, and there are collections of cells in here that are represented by these pink areas. These pink areas are the choroid plexuses. Each one of those areas that appear to be pink is a choroid plexus. Okay, this is a collection of cells that can actually filter the blood, okay? And you should remember the cells because we talked about them. They're a glial cell that we call ependymal cells. This is that 4th glial cell that we identified, and its primary function is to filter the blood and produce cerebral spinal fluid. Now, in the picture in our textbook, those ependymal cells look like simple cuboidal epithelium, didn't they? Do you remember where we find simple cuboidal epithelium?
I was not here and here.
In the kidney tubules, right? Okay, in the kidneys. Now, maybe you remember that our kidneys filter blood too, don't they? Okay, and they produce urine. Okay, so they're filtering the blood, and the product is the urine. Okay, so these do something kind of similar. They're going to be filtering blood, but what they produce is cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. They look like simple cuboid. Now, we find these in different locations. 1 and 2 are found lateral in the hemispheres. Okay? And you're going to find these in your sheep brain. When you do your brain dissection, you need to take one of those blunt metal probes. And if you'll notice, right here in this corpus callosum, does it look like there's a little slit in there? You can insert that probe there, and it will go all the way to the back of the hemisphere. So there is a space inside there. It's longitudinal in that hemisphere, okay? But you can put a probe in here and angle it back, and it'll go way back into that hemisphere. You have one on each side, so you will access it by way of the corpus callosum. Okay, the third one, do you remember me telling you that your thalamus was kind of like a yo-yo? So there's a space in between, right? Okay, that third one is actually going to be found around the upper portion of your thalamus. And it does extend down in between those two portions. So the third one is around the superior portion of the thalamus. You can see a space there, can't you? Okay. The fourth one is right in front of the cerebellum. This little bitty notch here, the little bitty notch there is the fourth one. Okay? Now these will all drain into a common canal. Okay? So we've got cerebral spinal fluid being produced in these lateral ventricles. It drains down. It will join with the third ventricle. And then between the third ventricle and the fourth, we have a continuation of a canal that connects this one to it too. That canal is called the cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. Okay? So, make sure you have a look at this model. Get some pictures of this model. This is anterior. This is the anterior. Can you see that there's two parts of it? These are your laterals. These are your laterals. Right here, at that opening of the corpus callosum, right in here that drains down, and then it joins with this third ventricle, which is around the thalamus. Then it drains on down, and right here is a good place to label as the cerebral aqueduct. Between the third and the fourth, that would be a good place to label as the cerebral aqueduct. And then here is your fourth ventricle here. So everybody should get a look at this. And I've got a question over there on this model. Okay? So you should be able to identify either one of these lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, or the fourth ventricle. Okay? So we've got two more of these. You need to pass these around so everybody gets a chance to look at them. Is there another one in here at a table? Right there? Okay. All right. So y'all make sure you get a look at these and figure out the orientation. All right, now, before we actually do our sheet brain dissection, we're going to cover the eye, because I want you to do the eye dissection at the same time. Okay, while we're doing dissections, we may as well do them both. So, anybody have any questions on this? Did we get, oh, one more feature we didn't see. There's a little gland called the pineal gland. Pineal gland. It's right up here behind the thalamus here. It's a little bitty round gland right here. So put a little circle there and label that the pineal gland. Okay? pineal gland is involved in the sleep-wake cycle. It produces melatonin. Are y'all familiar with melatonin? So it's involved in sleep-wake cycle, but it's also involved in the onset of puberty and sexual development. So those are the two major functions that I'm aware of with the pineal gland. Did we get everything else?